Okay, welcome to another episode of the Creatress Rising show. Thank you for being here, sisters. Today we have a beautiful friend of mine, Tina Nance. Welcome, Tina. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
So Tina is a yin yoga teacher. She's a yoga therapy teacher. She has a 100-hour yoga teacher training, which covers all sorts of feminine embodiment movement practices, somatic movement practices. And Tina has been doing this for, it's over 20 years now, really, isn't it, Tina? It's a, you know, you've got a lot of hours inside of your...
I think, long time.
Yeah. So, and I first met Tina when I went to Bali. I spent 6 weeks in Bali because I felt a bit lost in my life. And I went over there for 6 weeks, had my 2-year-old boy with me, and my intention was to really reclaim my creatress. And through my 6 weeks I did daily yoga classes with Tina, and I came home with this Creatress Rising concept. The business Creatress was born, and I came home and I experienced not only this incredible influx in my business, but I feel like, Tina, you are responsible for me receiving some of the greatest orgasms of my life. And
What a claim to fame. I love it.
Yes, absolutely. I put it down to the mind. I put it down to the mindfulness that comes through your trainings. It's not just yin yoga, but it's this incredible mindfulness journey that you took me on. So maybe we'll talk about that more in a little while. But Tina, tell me, how did you get started? More to come. How did you get started with yoga, and what is it about the practice that really juices you, inspires you?
Wow, how much time do we have? So I've been practicing my entire adult life. I first came to yoga when I'd just been traveling. I'd left home thinking I was going to leave Australia for about 6 months, and 5 years later I came home to Australia for the first time. So I kind of went off on this journey of exploration of self. And I was in my early 20s, and I came up with a lot of questions. I had a spiritual inquiry, even though I didn't call it that from a very young age. And so when I went traveling, that inquiry, that thirst, only expanded exponentially. So I had so many questions. And the first yoga teacher that I met, he wasn't actually very asana focused. He wasn't very body focused. He was, he taught satsang, question and answer. We did some meditation, some chanting. We did some asana as a preparation for satsang, but really just so we could be still and receptive. And so my first exposure to yoga was as a system of spiritual inquiry. So that definitely helped to satiate that thirst that I had. And then that started me on a whole quest. So I studied pretty fervently with my first teacher, who I met in London. And I studied with him for about a year before that first bloomed to taking me to India. And I went to India I was there for a little over a year the first time. And that's really, ironically, where I was exploring more of the embodied practices. So I sort of moved around and exposed myself to all the different styles of yoga that I could find. And what I was curious about was, as I moved my body in these ways, in these different ways, Ashtanga, Iyengar, Satyananda, these different ways of communicating and experiencing yoga. As I did that, what I wanted to explore was how the philosophy of yoga that I had been originally taught, how that blended with my direct experience in the body via a yoga practice. And so what I got more interested in was what was actually happening in my system in response to these practices. It was kind of like an experiment. And that kind of birthed a really deep passion of mine, which is really understanding how the mind, body, and spirit are connected via direct experience. And so I had an incredible year. And then eventually I did come back to Australia, and I just threw myself into lots of study. So I studied lots of different cultural perspectives on how the mind, body, and spirit are connected. So I did a lot of body work. I studied shiatsu, and I did a whole diploma in vibrational healing. I did kinesiology for a couple of years, every style of massage you can think of. And really, I was just looking through the lens of the Chinese lens, the Indian lens, the Thai lens, all the different cultural lenses on this connection of mind, body, and spirit. And then that just really informed a lot of depth and inquiry in my own personal practice. And then eventually I came across a system of yoga therapy that combined the understanding of the meridian system of traditional Chinese medicine. It worked with the meridian system that feeds life force into all the organ systems of the body inside of asana. So rather than via acupuncture or shiatsu or manual palpation of the body with touch, it was via yoga asana. And that was a 2-year yoga therapy program. So it gave me, and that part of me, that thirsty part of me, an opportunity to really dive in, to explore that in very succinct detail. And it was fantastic. And then that kind of created the base for the work that I continued to teach from there, the way that I practiced and taught yoga from there.
Beautiful. And that was one of my favorite experiences about working with you every day in Bali, was the different meridians and how much that helped amplify and release. And I went to Bali because I was very burnt out, and the kidney ones, oh my goodness, the kidney classes were just so, I think I asked you like 3 times, can we do another kidney one this week? Can we have another kidney class? I literally lived for my kidney meridian classes. They were amazing. And I feel, I remember the last few days I was there, we had dinner and you wrote out in your little stick figures all the kidney poses for me to do my own classes at home, because it was amazing. And so the other thing that I really, really loved was the mindfulness aspect. And I didn't notice that with any of the other yoga teachers that I've experienced ever. So can you tell me a little bit more about the mindfulness aspect and how that weaves in with this yoga therapy that you do?
I think it's potentially the most important piece. And the reason I say that is in all that time, like there was maybe 10 years there where I was like deeply dived in this kind of somatic self-inquiry, moving the body and seeing how it affected my emotional life, my mental life, how it connected me to my spiritual life, my intuitive body, my wisdom bodies. So inside all of that inquiry, like you said, you can get really specific. You can be really burnt out and tired and do a kidney practice, and it helps to boost your life force. You can do a practice where you're experiencing heartbreak and you can work with the heart or with the lungs with grief, or you can be very specific with your practice. So what that meant for me is that I was stirring a lot of stuff up. Like a lot of stuff was coming to the surface, because I was working in this understanding that your mind and your body are just 2 different faces of the same coin. They're the same thing expressing itself via these different mediums. And so therefore I was moving a lot into my awareness. But the tools that I didn't have in that early stage was how to be with what arises, how to be with all of this past history that we store in the body when it comes to the surface. And so when I first moved towards yin yoga, I started in this style of yoga therapy. And when I first moved towards yin yoga, I was living in Taiwan at the time. And I met Sarah Powers, who's one of the foundational teachers of yin yoga. And I studied with her while I was in Taiwan. And she brought to my practice, she brought this whole very concentrated focus on being with what arises, with mindfulness through the Buddhist lens. And it radically changed the way that I practice, because I think that the thing that it brought me most was that the journey up to that point, and maybe you can relate to this, Tamara, and maybe your viewers can relate to this as well. the spiritual journey to that point had felt like I was identified as this person that had a whole lot of stuff going on that was essentially broken. And I was doing all these practices to fix myself and get somewhere. And I was kind of on a pretty exhausting trajectory that like kind of has no end, right? Like, so what mindfulness gave me was this really powerful piece of recognizing that actually there's a part of me that I can connect to in this moment, right here, right now, amongst all this randomness and imperfection, all of my humanity. There's a part of me that I can connect to that has direct connection to insight, that has alert, attentive, tender, kind, compassionate awareness, that has wisdom, that has, there's a part of me that is whole and complete and full, available right now, and that I can connect to that part. And by landing in that part, then I can attend to what's arising. I can meet what's here from that place of awareness and relative equanimity and compassion. And it's with that combination of being aware of what's arising and knowing how to hold it and be with it from this place of wisdom and centeredness that started making all the difference to me. Then I was able to kind of both be in a part of me that had nowhere to get to, was already here, and then integrate these other parts of self that felt that were having the experience of being broken and experiencing suffering. And that's when it all started to shift and change for me.
Yeah. So this is my big inquiry during this summit and this process for me is what comes first? Is it the connection to the body? And then through the body, that access, we're releasing and letting go of all of those blockages and things that are stopping us from accessing that greater level of intuition, accessing our true self? Or is it something that has to happen all at once? You know?
You mean,
does that make any sense?
Yeah, like the cascade effect, or is it something that happens simultaneously?
Yeah, because I've always, you know, the intuitive system that I've always followed is just, you just access it now. But I want to go deeper, and I feel like, and this is just my personal tuning, I feel like to go deeper, I have to go deeper and release things from within my body, not just my, you know, subconscious mind or, you know, energetic field or anything like that. Like, it's actually body first.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what your experience is with all of that. I mean, you've been about the body for such a long time. Yeah, it's just a total hypothesis, and I never even thought to ask this question, but it just feels like the right question to ask right now.
I love that. So, I mean, this is where my passion is, because well, there's so many things I want to say right now, Tamara. Where do I start? So my school, I have a school where I run, as you mentioned, I bunch a series of 100-hour trainings, and it's called Somatic Sovereignty, the School of Embodied Self-Integration. So what I mean by that is there's a teacher that some of you might be aware of, and some of your listeners might be aware of. His name is Adyashanti. And I love one of his concepts where he talks about, we first have that experience often of up and out, where we kind of rise above our normal human experience and we experience something more expanded and greater, like a greater version of ourselves or God, or, you know, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But then the journey is down and in. And the down and in journey for me is integration. Because like I was saying, we can contact these expanded parts of our being, but unless that expanded part then goes in and integrates with mind, body, spirit, unless that integration happens, it doesn't play out as a palpable day-to-day experience. It just means we have a lot of, at least in my experience, we have a lot of peak experiences, a lot of aha moments, a lot of, I get it. But then we go back and we attract to the same relationship. We do the same, we play out the same roles with our kids, where it gets stuck in the same ways in all the different areas of our life. So what I'm most passionate about is the integration piece. That's where I think the rubber really hits the road. Having said that, another way to answer your question And for me, that happens through the body. And I can talk more about that in a minute. But another angle or another way to answer your question is that for some people like myself, the way that I connect to that up and out is actually via my body. So for me, when I'm in an embodied practice, it's a moving meditation. It's where my awareness moves from thought and my identity as the thinking mind, and it moves into and taps into something much greater. My seed of wisdom and awareness arises through my embodied practice. So that's two different ways to answer that question, is that one, I think there's this up and out and then down and in integration piece. But two, that the way that people get that up and out is very varied. And the people that are like myself, I'm what's called a HSP. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but it means highly sensitive person. But what that means is that I have heightened sensory processing sensitivity. So that means that my interoception is feeling inside, is very heightened. The insula, part of my brain called the insula, is very alive, very awake, so that has its pros and cons, but it means that I experience a lot of sensory information, and it means that I experience a lot in the body. So for people like me, or just for people that have a connection or affiliation with somatic practice as a meditation, then that seems to be where our access to a larger experience of ourselves shows up.
Yes, that's pretty much answered and kind of clarified all of my own personal tunings for the last like 6 months, because I've experienced that up and out many times, but still it's not integrated. Still my life shifts little bit by little bit, and it's really beautiful, and I've really enjoyed the journey, but it's like, okay, for me to go from here to here, which is where I want to go now, there's got to be some integration. And that's where it felt like the body needed to start. The body, we needed to start this process of Creatress Rising with the body. That was very, very clear. And then the other thing that I've really noticed about myself is that I'm far more intuitive. I've done a lot of this kind of intuitive work, but I'm far more intuitive when I go into my body to access that intuition and to access that wisdom.
Absolutely.
So I love.
I mean, the premise of my work on all levels, because I work in lots of different ways, but the premise of all levels of my work is that our bodies are the barometer of our souls. And what I mean by that, and anyone that studied with me before has heard me talk about this infinitum. So what I've noticed through my own experience and through, thousands of students and through study, and is that it's recognized that, and we can notice it directly for ourselves in the moment, but that when the thoughts that we're aligning with, that then create patterns and behaviors and ways of being, when the thoughts that we're aligning with are out of alignment with our truth, when they're not in alignment with our essence or who we really are, it literally creates a contraction in the body. And so our body is constantly either contracting or expanding in response to the thoughts that we're attaching to or identifying with. And so when we get that, one, it allows our body to be this seat that we can keep referring back to check in on where we're at in terms of alignment with our essence. But also there's a recognition that each time we haven't been listening, which, let's face it, is most of us most of the time, because most of us live from here, and we're just in the world that's just getting increasingly crazy and so much to deal with. We're all so busy. So most of us spend our lives from here up not really listening to this consistent communication of the body. And so that communication has to get louder and louder. So it becomes chronic tension, or becomes chronic pain, or eventually even disease. So the body is this great, it's this direct communication. And so when we get to the yoga mat, from my perspective, the work that I'm doing, what we're doing is unpacking all of that held past in the tissue from where we weren't listening and responding in the moment before. So we literally store our past in our tissue, and embodied practices was about kind of going in and unpacking that, which in the process of doing that brings a lot to the surface, not only physically, but psycho-emotional memory and content. And then, like we were talking about earlier, then it's the mindfulness piece of how to be with that when it arises, so it can both release and integrate into our day-to-day experience.
Yes. And I feel like that is why I had such great orgasms after returning from
I want to know
from my 6 weeks practice. It was like, because not only did I get to calm my mind and slow down, you know, I came to Bali as a pretty stressed out, overwhelmed, single mom, 2-year-old, and I left in this very conscious, very self-aware, very open place, because I feel like I was able to, through all the movement practices, release a whole bunch of tension and connect and feel into my body in a way that I'd never done before. Amazing. Purely because of that consistency and that mindfulness. And the wisdom that I accessed during that 6 weeks is still a huge part of my practice and my, you know, awareness today. And it's affected my trajectory and, you know, my whole life. Like the business, you know, the business Creatress and what came from that is a whole other series and event in itself. So I won't go into it, but just 6 weeks. And I think this is where it started for me as well, because I'd never had a regular yoga practice before then. And I'd never really found my style of yoga. And I, to this day, still absolutely love yin yoga, because it's the yoga that slows me down and gets me connected to my body so beautifully. And just experiencing that, and then experiencing times where I wasn't moving my body and I wasn't releasing and I wasn't kind of letting go of that old stuck stuff, and the difference in my, you know, my whole life, even my orgasms, and, you know, the way that I relate to my business and my children, and all of that is polar, you know, it's polar opposite. So yeah, it just makes so much sense. I want to know more about your daily practice and the way that you move to support yourself in your life and growth and Creatress Rising, you know?
Yeah. It's progressed and evolved enormously over the years. So when I first started yoga, like I was explaining, it was very much a self-inquiry. And I was following a lot of external guidance and seeing what showed up in my own experience inside of that. So I'd work with specific practices for a specific purpose and see what happened. And eventually that kind of birthed into me really understanding that system. And then I could choose, like I mentioned before, I could be like, okay, last night I went out and had a bottle of wine. I'm feeling a bit sluggish and run down, a bit grumpy today. I'll do a liver class, you know? So I was kind of directing it. But then eventually what happened is that my body started to direct the practice. And if I was doing external direction, it felt like something was kind of getting in the way. And so what I mean by that is I would come into things that my body was used to doing, follow asana movements that I was aware of and familiar with, to get into the body, to kind of make that transition in. But then that would just bring me into a greater listening relationship with my own tissue. And then slowly, the more I would get out of the way, the more I would just follow where my body wanted to move. So I might notice something in the neck wanted to unwind. So I would just allow some unwinding, and that might start something unwinding in the shoulder, and that might move down to something in the side body or in the hip, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I noticed is my body would just start to unwind. And now, you know, I understand that it's the fascia inside of the body doing it's what it very naturally does, is unwind when we bathe it with enough presence. So my practice has become very spontaneous. It's become about coming in, creating the space to come in, to listen, and then allow it to unwind. I literally call it embodied unwinding. And sometimes it looks like yoga asana, and sometimes it looks like me rolling around on the floor. So it can look like anything, but it's afterwards, it's the most direct practice to me. And when I say direct, it gives me the most direct release, because it goes to exactly where my body needs it without me needing to have cognitive understanding or processing of that. It just goes straight to. However, quite often inside of that, a lot of insight will arise, a lot of clarity will arise. And it allows life force, like wherever the life force is stuck in my system, it allows it to move. And my experience is that the life force in our system is intelligent. So when we get out of the way of that intelligence, it knows exactly what to do. Our bodies know exactly what they need. And also the intelligence, call it Shakti, call it Chi, call it Prana, it has its own innate wisdom, in that my experience is when I allow this life force to move in, through, and as me, uninhibited, that's when I'm in connection with that broader aspect of self. That's when I'm in connection with my own wisdom, my own truth, my own power, my own sense of who I really am. It comes from allowing this energy to move through and open me from the inside out. So that's what my practice looks like these days. And more now, I'm teaching that. I'm going to share an embodied unwinding practice with your people here. It's
inside
more
of the Creatress Rising App. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And so I have one more question around feminine embodiment, because I know that that's a really big part of your practice these days, and and what you're teaching inside of your 100-hour workshop. What does feminine embodiment mean for you, and what is it giving us as women?
Wow, that's a big question. First of all, I think that just embodiment itself, from a spiritual perspective, is feminine. Like, when we talk about this feminine energy that is rising on the planet, it's a very popular sentence, but I really feel that. I really feel like there's a shift in consciousness that's happening, and we've been in much more masculine focused times. We've lived through a patriarchal age that's now shifting radically. We see it with the Me Too movement. We see it on so many levels. Yeah. And I think that from my perspective, a part of that is recognizing spiritual practice that's birthed deep inside the body. That, for me, in and of itself, is a spiritual lens, is a feminine lens. Was it Christine Northrup, I think? I don't want to misquote here, but she said something like, if a woman is looking for her place of power, do you know this quote? If a woman's looking for a place of power, look in all the places where that power has been, I'm going to misquote it, where that power has been redirected or taken away through society, condition, and religion. That's not verbatim at all, but that's the idea. And that, like, the areas of power for us as women, where we find that connection to source that I was just describing, is through the body, is through our emotional intelligence, rather than being inside a spiritual practice where we're overcoming and transcending our emotions. We're listening to our emotions as barometer for our soul, where we're looking at our blood, where, that area where it's being shamed. I live here in an island where you can't go into the temple if you're bleeding, and there's so much shame around menstruation for women. And yet, if we look deeper, we start to understand, and it's a big part of what I teach, is that the menstrual cycle, and indeed all the phases of a woman's hormonal life, pre-menopause, perimenopause, menstruation, like all the way along, all of those are initiations, and the cycles of our menstruation are definitely portals into exploring our own power. There's so much more I could say about that, but we can, you know, leave it there for the moment. Our sensuality and our sexuality. It's been deemed as an area of shame, particularly through the religious lens, for so long. And yet, definitely in my experience, and this is very much included in my work, I've had the experience that it's my uninhibited sensual energy, when it's allowed to express itself through my body, that I resource huge amounts of power that I think has been perceived as dangerous and threatening, and thus the suppression of it over the years. And also the way that we've sort of misused that power in order to manipulate and get what we want. And, you know, so I think bringing consciousness around sexuality and the power inherent in it, that's a big part of feminine embodiment. There's so many aspects, but I would definitely say that the areas, I agree with that quote, that the areas where we've been taught not to look is exactly where to look for us as women. That's where all the power of juice is hiding.
Yeah, beautiful. Amazing. And Tina, what is it that you are sharing with us inside of the Creatress Rising app? Please tell.
So I have 2 30-minute practices of yoga. So one is a yoga therapy practice. I called it Shraddha yoga, because Shraddha means the wisdom that comes from direct experience. And that's really what I'd like to invite people to experience in their own bodies, is to explore the meridians. In one is a hatha yoga practice, one is a yin yoga practice, so that they themselves can be inside that embodied self-inquiry. So they're generalized classes, meaning rather than classes that are specific for heart expansion or kidney rejuvenation or etc. These are overall well-being and thriving classes. So there's a yoga therapy practice, which is the hatha, more dynamic, and a yin practice, which is the more inward and working with the fascia and slowing down. And then the third practice that I'll be sharing with you is the embodied unwinding practice, which is that surrendered movement, letting the body unpack itself.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, I really look forward to doing them, and thank you so much for joining me.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm so excited about this app. I love this whole idea of attending to every area of our life, because that's really what integration is, really, you know, like not leaving any part out, from my point of view. Yeah.
And you know, as I've been writing, you know, writing copy and working with, you know, working with my copywriter, it's like we're honoring each area of our life, but there's been something else missing. I'm like, there's something else coming in there, and it's taking back the power in each area of our life.
Yeah,
honoring and taking back the power in every area of our life. So
and never
thank you for being
right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you, Tina. This has been amazing.
That's my pleasure. So lovely to talk with you.